This is the Roar webinar series. I'm Josefina Bonilla, and with us today is Dr. Lisa Coleman. Dr. Coleman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me again, Josefina. It's always good to see you.
And of course, I'm going to change this view a little bit. So give me 1 second so I can switch back and have more of the gallery view, which I like better because we can, you know, I'm fond of thinking that we're sitting next to each other.
Me too. That's why I have it on gallery so I can look at you.
So this is the way it's going to be broadcasting. We have some people here on Zoom with us, but we are also broadcasting on Facebook Live. So again, welcome. This is our Monday ritual.
It is. It's one of my favorite things. I look forward to it because I know on Monday this is going to happen.
That's right. And I was thinking at least, so since I don't see you that often anymore,
I know.
I could see you on Mondays.
I know. I wish I saw you more often, but this is great for right now.
And I am going to also start recording on this end. Super. So Lisa, let's talk about diversity and inclusion. I was thinking about it this weekend, actually, how people get into the field.
Oh, yeah, that's a good
about that, and you're thinking, how can I get started? Because I know you were not always a chief diversity officer.
There was a time before. It's true, Josefina. There was a time before. But I'm an old diversity officer now. So I've been at it for some time. So I usually say this. You know, when I got into the field, it was a little different. Right. Most people came in and they were kind of generalists.
In HR or?
Yeah. So I'm going to describe a little bit of how people came in. So in business, a lot of people came in through two ways: through HR, so human resources, and through affirmative action. And so, and thinking about issues of gender usually and race as those, because usually corporations had to track some version of that, right? And so there was some kind of, whether it's an affirmative action officer, or maybe that wasn't their title, but someone sort of looking at those issues. And usually, yes, placed in HR. Or there was someone who may have been working as in the legal areas, depending on the company, right? So a general counsel's office, some kind of office like that. So it may have been operational, but usually related to the law. Again, really focused on sort of coming out of that affirmative action, sort of looking at race and gender, and sometimes disability, depending on the company. And then in higher education, the only caveat is that, and I'll talk about government too, the only caveat is that some of the other people, if they didn't come from HR isn't as, depending on the institution, private institutions are a little different than public institutions in higher ed. So they may have come out of HR or the general counsel's office. But the other two areas people would have come out of is student affairs, because student affairs has like offices of multicultural affairs, right? So those offices that used to be just directed at students. And so those were sort of elevated. Or you had your faculty member who was someone like me, which is kind of how I emerged, who was studying things like race and gender and ability, right, in those area studies or LGBTQ plus things. And those people were kind of plucked out of the faculty and then appointed into these positions. In government, what we saw was a lot of the people who initially emerged, again, came out of the equal opportunity areas, although that wouldn't be so much out of HR necessarily, because, you know, in the government, there are huge branches just looking at equal opportunity. So that's sort of the initial emergence. But now that's not the case anymore. And I love it when a field grows up. So, you know, we were young, we were like little pioneers going out there into the world unknown. So we just went out there and, you know, did our best and tried. Lots of us learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes and learned a lot. But now, if you wanted to come into the field, and I'll talk a little bit about how you might get experience, but now you can come into the field and you could just do diversity and inclusion in engineering, right? And just work for an engineering company or a firm or in higher ed, or you could just do diversity and inclusion in the sciences, right? And we know the challenges in the sciences. Or you might just do it in the law, or you might just do it only in business. And then that's why I said I started as a generalist. And a lot of us, we were working across multiple sectors, trying to deal with talent management, promotion, all of the things within our companies, and all of the things across our organizations. And now we have teams. So I might be a chief diversity officer, let's say in a corporation, but then I'd have someone who might be helping me on the talent end. I might have someone who's helping me on the climate and culture end. I might have someone who's helping me on thinking about developing leadership, right? And then I'm responsible for all of that. And that's the segmentation and the fragmentation of a field, which tells that it's maturing.
So two things. One, as a, so I want to talk about from the perspective of somebody that's starting from scratch, right? And this is something that they're passionate about. It's something that they think about, they live it in their own personal life, and maybe that's the field that they're interested in, but they don't know how to get in. What are your recommendations to that person?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I want to say, I know there are a lot of, I get a lot of calls from a lot of young people. I've actually thought about maybe hosting something like getting into diversity and inclusion 101. So I think there are a lot of ways. I'm going to talk about this first from the pandemic, vantage point, because I think right now people are struggling how to get into things while they're at home. And so the first thing I've been telling people is to attend things like this, webinars. Learn as much as you can, because the questions now that will be asked as you're going into interviews or fields, et cetera, will be different than when I first started, right? People were much more exploratory when I first started, but now people have definitive things that they want and that they're looking for. So they're going to ask specific questions, which means you need to be much more prepared in terms of the specificity of the field and the growth of the field. So attending webinars, doing informational interviews with people like who are chief diversity officers, or people who are no longer chief diversity officers who didn't do so well. I always say you want to learn from those people who made mistakes as well, right? So you want to learn from those people who have succeeded, but you also want to learn from those people who haven't. I think also volunteering, right? Volunteering to participate, to help out, also gives you insight into the behind the scenes kinds of things that might be happening, right? I have a lot of young people who want to volunteer in my office or volunteer to help me out to produce programs or things like that. And that can be an excellent learning opportunity. And then the last thing I will say is develop some kind of learning cohort. Right? If you know you're passionate about this field, you probably know there are probably some other people. So begin to develop your network of people who are both who are, sort of more seasoned in the field, but your peer network. And I can't say that enough about that. When I look around now, including you, Josefina, right? I look at the people who were my peers. We all came up and through this together. So we were able to support each other, ask different questions, really think about things together and say, okay, well, what's happening for you? What's happening over there? And then we were able to do things in our own organizations or in our own field. And that didn't mean we're all in the same field, right? I know people in the corporations, I know people in government, et cetera, but at least we were able to then help to navigate. Now, outside of the pandemic, I would say, yes, volunteering, getting out there, showing up to events, showing up to organizations that are dedicated to this work, right? There are all kinds of organizations out there. And I'm not going to name them because depending on your field or sector, there's been a lot of growth, right? There are things, organizations directed toward business. So if you are a person of Asian descent and you want to be involved in diversity and inclusion in the organizations that are particular to that cohort and group in business, there is an organization that's primarily dedicated to Asian Americans in business who are interested in diversity, equity, inclusion. That's what I mean about the maturation of the field. That didn't exist, 15 or 20 years ago, right? And so if you're interested in science, there are people I am interested in science, right? Science, technology, and engineering, and diversity and inclusion. And there are all kinds of organizations that you can join. And you can learn through those organizations and then show up to their programs. Now, it's harder to show up to some programs because they're online and sometimes there are limitations depending on the company. I've noticed this. But I would say, avail yourself of many opportunities as possible. And lastly, and then figure out what you don't know.
Which I think that's probably the hardest thing, because you know what you know, but because you're entering the field, there's a lot of things that you don't know.
That's right.
That's right. You
And
know,
so I say that's why those informational interviews are so key, because then you can find out what you don't know. And that's what I mean about interviewing people who also didn't do well. And I've been surprised at the number of people who, they decided not to pursue it, or they moved out of the field, and they will tell you about the mistakes and what some of the things that they encountered. And I think that's super helpful. One of the things that I've done even in my own organizations is to do what I call cohort analyses. So I don't just study the people and the climate within the organization. I study the people who've left the organization, because that tells me something.
That's very important, because it's not, and some of the reasons that they leave, it's not necessarily on them,
That's
but
right.
the organization that they work with.
That's
And
right.
and talking about, I know that sometimes we're so hungry, and we, as a friend of mine said, we're so thirsty.
Indeed, indeed.
That's right. So we're so hungry to get in that we're accepting a company that's really unacceptable.
That's right.
But we want to get in, and then we're unsuccessful.
Yeah. The subtext of my book is going to be, are you ready? And so one of the questions that I'm asking in that text is,
I haven't received any.
It's not in publication yet. We're still in draft process. But one of the questions that we will be asking is, and this is one of the questions about organizations, is where are they on the readiness scale? And you, as a diversity, inclusion, equity officer, need to actually ascertain where that organization is. And that will determine whether you actually want to join that organization, right? I have both joined and left organizations. I haven't left organizations mostly because I've left organizations mostly because they were at the maturation stage that it was time for me to move on. And if you know me, I love innovation, I love startup, that's who I am. So for me, I want to come in, do the setup, do all of that, and then I'm pretty much gonna move on. It takes a long time to do that sometimes, but for lots of people, what they really want to do is the second part, right? They want to be that person who's the long term, who takes it from this point to that point. And so you have to figure out who you are, what kind of leader, worker, person you are in this space. I understood early on, I come out of computer science. I'm a big tech geek who's super interested in fast moving, fast paced kinds of things. It's why I entered into this field, because it was an emerging field, right? So that makes sense. So then you have to figure out who you are. Then you have to figure out who the organization is. And that means you also have to do interviews with organizations. So not just with the people, diversity officers, but you have to study organizations. What are organizations that seem like they are on the front line doing? And what are those organizations that seem like they're not? And I'd also like to say this, study hard, because lots of organizations that say they're doing a great job.
But I'm going to switch gears. Let's talk about now a person that has been in, whether an entrepreneur or in a corporation, and they are leaders in that space, but now they want to switch into BI, right? And unfortunately, I don't think, unless you think differently, that there's a direct road from being an executive in your field to be a CDO in another space.
That's absolutely true. There is no direct route. There is no direct route. And I would say in many ways, I was one of those people, right? I remember when the first president asked me to be a diversity officer, and I was like, what is that? And what would I do? What does that mean? And I don't understand, right? There was no direct route, because yeah, exactly. I was like, what are we going to do? And so, like I said, we kind of figured it out together. But I think now, if you want to make that transition, I do think sometimes even some coursework can be helpful, right? There are lots of these new now. I know a lot of them are, high priced. So, but there are some that are, less expensive, and some that are free.
Are there any that are free 99?
Free 99, exactly. There are many that are free now, and especially during this pandemic, people are offering lots of courses, right? From law firms, from corporations, etc. And so that's where then you can begin to figure out, okay, because what this is about is a skill map, right? So you have to take your skills that you have already and figure out how they map onto this diversity and inclusion and equity platform, right? So what are the skills that you've already developed? It depends on what area you're in. So if you're in operations, you might have some really great skills in terms of thinking about operationalizing, or as people talk about, uh, uh, OD, right? So how you actually assess, right, and develop. Or you might have great HR skills. So you're coming out of HR. So maybe you have talent management, um, climate and culture skills in terms of transformation, right? Depending on where you were in HR. If you're a C-suite leader, right? Maybe right now you're an executive vice president and you're thinking, I want to bring this into my portfolio. Then you have great leadership skills, right? And so thinking about how you map leadership onto diversity, inclusion, and equity, and thinking about changing C-suites and boards and things like that. So that's, again, it goes back to that. It's important to know who you are, the skill sets that you have, and then how you're going to map those on, and then learn about the field, right, to participate in these things so that you can figure out what those skills are and the particular areas that you might want to go in. So it doesn't mean that you have to be an HR person who goes into HR diversity and inclusion, because maybe you want to be more expansive than that. But at least you can say, these are the skills that I have that I developed in this HR space. I think it maps onto this diversity and inclusion and equity space in this way. And these are the areas that I want to grow.
I find that what I've heard is that right now, in terms of looking for a role like this, looking for any role, many companies are looking for people that have the same title. So it's not as though, so the mapping, so you have to be creative.
That's right.
How you position yourself, because a lot of companies are immediately just negating any folks. So if they're looking for a CDO, if you don't have CDO in your history,
that's exactly right.
They're just negating you as an applicant.
No, that's exactly right, Josefina. And so again, I think that that's why you have to do the work in advance to figure out, right, how you, because I mean, we know that, of course, getting a job is also about marketing yourself, right? And figuring out how you market yourself and brand yourself appropriately for the context and the situation. So right now, if I were an HR person who had, limited, let's say, diversity, inclusion, and equity experience in that formally, right? But this has been a passion area, etc. I might divide up my resume. I might divide up my resume to say, these are my professional experiences, but these are all the other experiences I've had. And these are the kinds of learning experiences that I've had. And then in my letter of intent, my letter of purpose, my cover letter, whatever it's called, then I would say, while I've not had the title CDO, I've had these other leadership titles. And this is how these skills map on, right? So that then you identify that, as opposed to them trying to figure it out. Because you don't want to leave it up to the company or to the HR officer inside the company to try to figure you out. You've got to present as much as you can up front.
And I think things have also changed in the last couple months, where companies were not really looking at cover letters, and now they are again.
Yes, they are. That's right.
So they become as important as the resume.
Right, because think of it now, we're back to, in some ways, older and newer forms of communication, right? So we have to write better because we are communicating offline. We're not in person in the same ways. So that kind of verbal and oral in-person communication, we're just not able to do it at the same way. So you're right. And I also say, even if they don't ask for a cover letter, unless they absolutely say, it will be held against you, then send one. Or the other thing that, of course, people do at the top of their resumes, on the side, on the bottom, however, you list your skills, you list some kind of, mini statement. I cannot encourage that enough, especially if you're trying to transition from one field to another.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I need to look at my resume and redo it.
Me too.
And I think that's you should always keep a master resume. Would you agree with that? And that way, things that, like employee resource groups, if you have experience in that space, how do you put it in?
If I were better at this, you're probably good at this, Josefina. I'm not good at it. Like if I should have like a document that's always open that I'm just dropping things in, right, that I'm doing, and then you can add it to your resume. I'm not that good about it, but
I'm not either. Although
But
I was shaking my head as though I was, I am not.
but yeah, that's like a great. I mean, when I was, I think when I was on the job market more, like more consistently and more aggressively, which was most of my life, I was like constantly updating my resume, right? And I can't say that enough, because the more information and the more current information you have, especially right now, right? Because people are interested in the currency of the current moment. And so that's important to show that you are um, involved, doing your homework, and that your skills are applicable to what's happening now. And I'll say this because, again, remember, diversity, inclusion, and equity, a lot of people are talking about, obviously, the differential impacts in terms of race and gender, LGBTQ plus persons, but remember also disability, right? When we come out of this, there's going to be so much more, right, work. People have heard me say this. This isn't the new normal. It is a new unusual, but there will be, right? Just like after 9/11, we had some changes. We will have changes, and so we have to figure out, right, how we are going to be part of those changes. And I think to be thinking about that now is to think about how you're updating your resume, think about the skills that you're building, and think about the networks that you're creating.
One of the things that you have talked about is the variety of generations that are in the workforce, right? And I think that with the pandemic, there's a lot of folks that are now having to stay at work longer,
Yeah.
right? So they're not able to retire as they were thinking. And so you have this influx of new folks coming in, folks that can no longer retire as they expected. And so, there's a range of folks, and any of those ranges are looking at these opportunities. So how do you, as an individual, say, I'm competing with
Yes.
Generation Xers, maybe I'm a boomer, which I'm not. I just want to be clear.
And I know you're not part of the silent generation. They're over 80, Josefina.
So imagine all those folks competing for jobs,
Yeah.
competing for D&I jobs, because obviously this is very impactful and it's part of what we want to be.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I've done a lot of these presentations about generations, as you know, and you're absolutely right. I'm going to mess up on the statistics right now because they're not in front of me, but I think it's like something like about 900 million people are over the age of 58 or something like that are in the workforce now. That is going to go up to something like, I think it's 40. I can't remember. It's 40. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's way more. It's like 1.2 billion or something like that. It's something, I can't remember the numbers, but that's because of what's happening. We're going to live longer. So I was just at this presentation where this young woman from the University of Arizona was talking about how we're going to live until we're 115 if you're born into the new generations. And I was like, well, I'm old, so I don't have to worry about it. All right. Living until you're 115, and then we have, right, people who are entering into the workforce, at younger and younger ages. We see this in higher ed. So I always say one of the reasons I love higher ed is I get to see, we don't have retirement age in higher ed. So we have lots of people who are over the age of 80, and then we have people who are coming in sometimes who are these little geniuses at 14 and 15 years old, right? So, right, so managing that has always been part of the project for us. But I think you're exactly right. How do you stay relevant, right? If you're part of one of the generations, the mature generations, how do you stay relevant? Well, I think there are three ways. One is you just have to read, you have to do your homework, you just have to keep abreast of what is emerging. That's really hard to do, but you just have to. And that's why I said peer networks are so important. And you have to, when you're seasoned, you have to develop even greater peer networks, because now you have to have multi-generational peer networks, right? You have to have peer networks of people who are much younger than yourself, especially if you're seasoned or older, right? Because then you have to get new inputs, right? Because I think the best of generational work is you have seasoned people who have the wisdom and the experience, but then you have younger generations who are saying, well, these are the things that are emerging, and these are the things that we need to be thinking about. And the co-creation of that, right, in a company is the best. Those are the kind of companies that do really well and excel, right? Because they have the wisdom and they have the energy of the youth. If you're Blockbuster, you just have the wisdom and then you don't take the youth, right? So that's the kind of thing where I think, right, if you're a seasoned person, you just need to figure out how you're getting better inputs so that you, from new generations and new developments, so that you are actually able to make yourself relevant. I'll use myself as an example. I'm not a boomer, but I'm not a millennial. And so I guess I know. So I'm kind of on the border, I think. Anyway, so I think that what has been important to me is, I mean, even when I think about my phone, right? I have all these nieces and nephews. They help me, and when they take my phone and do things, I actually ask them. I say, so what are you doing? Where did you learn that? How did you blah, 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 right? Instead of just letting them do it, I actually use it as a learning opportunity for me to learn something, right? Similarly, one of the things I've been doing a lot is when even with my own team, I'll ask a lot of questions of the younger people with whom I work. How did that happen? How did we make that happen? What would make this better? What would bring in different kinds of audiences, right? So I think also asking the right questions, then you can get different kinds of input. But I'm not gonna lie, it's hard to stay relevant. It's hard to keep on top of everything. And so you do need to carve out particular time to do so. We're all really busy. So I always say, what's your 1 to 2 hour a week homework time, right? Think of it as like you're back in school without the professor, looking over your shoulder. But what are you learning, right? Because we know that learners and people who are curious do better in the long term in terms of viability in the workforce than those people who aren't.
And there's so many areas where you can get this information. But the thread that was woven through everything that you said was one, the learning piece.
Yeah.
Get the information. There's YouTube, there's Coursera, there's so many paid and unpaid places that you can
So
get
many.
information.
So
And
many.
then the other thing is peer to peer.
Peer to peer. Peer to
Yeah.
peer. Peer to
And
peer is so
you're
important.
right. The nice thing about now is that people are more approachable. They're
Yeah.
more available. So you can send those emails. And there's not a problem saying, hey, I don't know how to do this, or I hope you don't mind me reaching out for some guidance. That's the way to begin a conversation. And more than not, people are available.
No, that's absolutely right. And I say that I have learned so much. I can't, there weren't a lot of chief diversity officers who preceded me, but I've learned so much from my peers, right? Where I've learned about all the various things that people have had to navigate. And then when those things have emerged, I've been much better prepared, right? And I also have the right networks to go out and say, okay, now I'm in this situation, right? It's not exactly like the situation that you and you were in, but I have these different tools, and then I can draw on, right, those networks to help me then navigate. So again, I can't say that enough. And again, that multi-generational, right now, I have
So
multi-generational inputs. I have people, some people call me the 80-year-old whisperer, because I have a lot of friends who are over 82, and I have a lot of friends who are below 25. And so that's the best, that's the sweet spot.
super important to do that. Well, Dr. Coleman, as always, this was great conversation. We will again be here next Monday with Dr. Lisa Coleman, Josefina Bonilla, and you were part of the ROAR webinar series. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. See you next Monday.
See ya.
See ya.